All right. The premise of this is that we are trying to provide an overview in this session of rhetoric and dialectic taught together to cultivate wisdom and eloquence from the grammar stage through the rhetoric stage. And then Pastor is going to extend on that, talk about applications. One thing I think that motivates Pastor Cain about this is he's really been doing an intensive, concentrated study of rhetoric in recent months, and he's recognizing ever more clearly how much neglect there has been in homiletics education of the arts of rhetoric that were explicitly tied to rhetorical training in Renaissance time. So we're trying to just build awareness of that. I don't have very much exposure at all to grammar level education. I thought I was doing fairly well to get down to 6th and 7th grade level from collegiate. My whole career has been at the collegiate level, but I started, because of my activities in CCLE, I started to get really dissatisfied with the sense that I was an ivory tower guy trying to tell people in the trenches how to do their job. And so I took a position as headmaster in Cheyenne, Wyoming, and also taught 6th, 7th, and 8th graders in that at Trinity Lutheran School. And now this year I'll be teaching again 6th and 7th graders at Austin Classical School. So I'm excited about that. So I can translate quite a bit of what I'm telling you today into teaching children in the logic stage of education. But I need somebody, and I've been talking with Jocelyn Benson, about maybe addressing, maybe dovetailing and talking about how these principles apply with the early stages on up. But I would appreciate any comments anybody has based on your experience and generalizations that you're making and connections you can make as we wrap this up today. One of the reasons I wanted to read a short paper is to utilize this 45 minutes such that we have time for discussion afterwards. So I'm specifically looking for some input with grammar stage education. This is a quote from Luther. Now, if, as we assume, there were no souls, and there were no need at all of schools and languages for the sake of the scriptures and of God, this one consideration alone would be sufficient to justify the establishment everywhere of the very best schools for both boys and girls, namely, that in order to maintain its temporal estate outwardly, the world must have good and capable men and women, men able to rule well over land and people, women able to manage the household and train children and servants aright. Statements like these, easy to come by, indicate the importance Dr. Luther placed on education. The hypothetical notwithstanding, a universe where there were no souls, Luther clearly considers the very best schools those based on a classical liberal arts curriculum to educate boys and girls for two ends: growth in the faith for the sake of the scriptures and God, and cultivation of good leaders for both the temporal estate and families. Those parts of the curriculum that equip especially for handling God's truth well and for leadership are dialectic and rhetoric, which should not just be mastered theoretically, but applied so as to cultivate wise judgment. That's what we're up to in these sessions. I didn't know that until I just read it. Okay, so we chose well. Through these arts of wisdom and eloquence, I admit I'm flying by the seat of my pants. I'm old, leave me alone. These arts of wisdom and eloquence, or through these, students develop mental dexterity and aesthetic sensibilities, and is ultimately equipped to be a good Christian exercising practical wisdom. In the restored man, Dialectic and rhetoric will go along hand in hand as the regime of the human faculties intended that they should. That's a quote from my hero, Richard Weaver. I need to read it again. Why isn't this... How do you scroll this with the pad, the touchpad? That's what I'm doing.
Yeah, put it over to the right.
Oh, is that it? There, yeah, it wasn't on the page. Whoops, I did 4 fingers. Okay, in the restored man, listen to this is profound. In the restored man, dialectic and rhetoric will go along hand in hand as the regime of the human faculties intended that they should do. This is the restorative effort of classical Lutheran education, built around dialectic and rhetoric and aimed at equipping students to pursue excellence. Indeed, liberal arts schooling always seeks to educate the conscience, and liberal arts thinking blended with Christian theology promises the greatest opportunity for genuine character education. Of the 3 elements of the Trivium, rhetoric is most helpful in the construction of a total curriculum with character formation and cultural leadership as its chief goals. That's from Wisdom and Eloquence by Littlejohn and Evans. I just kind of gloss over the whole character development thing. Rhetoric, along with dialectic, forms not only the mental habits capable of treating of truth, beauty, and goodness, but also character. To understand this dynamic entails understanding a relationship of dialectic to rhetoric, then of poetics to rhetoric, and ultimately of rhetoric to ethics. This paper therefore details my own approach and its pedagogical underpinnings to teaching rhetoric and dialectic. The analysis culminates in some observations on the well-known sentence that captures the educational bearing of Lutheran reformers such as Luther, Melanchthon, Bugenhagen, and Sturm. The aim of education is a wise and eloquent piety. Mrs. Ventine.
Yeah.
That the premise for our evening session was just articulated there.
Yeah.
Teaching toward this is working out really well. Teaching toward the achievement of excellence in the practical arts is different from teaching for the mastery of subject matter. Okay, mastery of content is a different activity than cultivating tools for thinking, for learning, and so forth. The former features praxis and minimizes theory. The latter emphasizes contemplation in theory. Theory informs practice, to be sure, but the seminar-style discussion of readings, the great books approach, will not help students hone their rhetorical or dialectical skills as much as getting in front of an audience and making arguments or engaging in debate about contemporary controversy. To master the piano, one does not merely immerse oneself in music theory or read the lives of great musicians. One learns to read notes and practices every day until the skill becomes second nature. Theory is then tackled as one matures in one's art. Theory follows practice. Again, theory is vital, but it is not age appropriate to lead with volumes of theory. That would fall under drinking from fire hose. All right. It also falls under, say it for me, Pastor Henderson here?
Yes.
But say the Latin phrase for me. I first.
Non multa sed multum.
Okay. No.
Not many, but much.
That's right. And so leading, and most of the rhetoric courses that I bump into in classical schools lead with reams of theory. They start by reading lots of rhetorical theory in 10th grade. And I would, in this article, I review how I teach it more in terms of giving them measured doses of rhetorical theory and a few excerpts, like we're doing in our summer seminar, just a few excerpts of some of Aristotle's works, and then lots of nuts and bolts and lots of practice. But then they read more theory as they get older. In my public speaking course, I attempt to lay a foundation in rhetoric that guides students in the fundamentals of speech composition. What one considers fundamental is, of course, open to interpretation, but I demonstrate why a rhetorical approach to the art of speech making in the classical liberal arts vein teaches the true fundamentals and elevates the enterprise without overburdening students with 2,500 years of theory. I should state prior to continuing that in my view, the ACCS schools that I visited in Central Texas recently all have schools of rhetoric because they use school of rhetoric as a synonym for high school. But they generally have one course in rhetoric that I've known in their curriculum. And it's kind of like reading Aristotle, Cicero, and Quintilian, and then they do a little debating and they write about it. But in my book, as I study the classical liberal arts curriculum, what you need to have a solid foundation starting in the logic stage is fundamentals of public speaking, and then you need argumentation and debate because that addresses left brain skills and ties into logic, and then you need advanced public speaking, which focuses more on cultivation of style and imagination and utilizes imitatio as a way to help students cultivate their voice. And then oral interpretation of literature is a nice little capstone in terms of building a foundation in the masterful use of language. Okay? So that would be my ideal curriculum for the logic and the rhetoric stage, spanning from 7th grade to 11th grade. All right. I begin by pointing out to my students that they already know a great deal about eye contact, gestures, volume, rate, pitch, and so forth, and that I could cover those topics in about a half hour. So what are we going to discuss for the rest of the semester? This pedagogical move generates enthusiasm on the part of my college students and assures them that they will not again be force-fed the minutiae of rhetorical mechanics that they mastered long ago. So when I first taught this, I was still a college professor. I propose studying the art of rhetoric from a traditional liberal arts perspective. I then pose a question: why are you at a university? If you just want a good job that pays well, you could spend a lot less time and money going to a tech school and learning a trade. What do you get at a university that you don't get elsewhere? Eventually, they take the bait and they say a liberal arts education. This realization, of course, raises the question, what is a liberal arts education? And so we're off and running. And I begin by explaining the role of rhetoric in the liberal arts curriculum and how it's related to dialectic and how they can be understood as cultivating wisdom and eloquence. By the way, what I teach in my introductory classes at the university level, ideally and in the past, were taught at ages 12 and 13. But that's where we're at, you know. So eventually, we're doing that at Wittenberg Academy, actually. I'm teaching my college classes at Wittenberg Academy, but I'm not teaching them at a college level. I've pared them down a little bit, but it's the same general approach. And they love it. They do just fine. Someday I would like to see that, you know, that college education would be reserved for the study of advanced rhetorical theory. That 2,500 years on it. I then discuss with them the nature of liberal arts education, borrowing heavily from Dorothy Sayers. This is followed by a definition of rhetoric and an explanation of how rhetoric was, in its golden age, considered the most humane of the humanities. The first thing that I've assigned in my Austin Classical School, they use the university model there. Are you familiar with that? So the parents are co-teachers. They do both homeschooling and 2 days in the classroom. in which I'll be teaching. So the first thing we're going to do is discuss passages from Dorothy L. Sayers' Lost Tools of Learning. This is followed by a definition of rhetoric and an explanation of how rhetoric was, in its golden age, considered the most humane of the humanities. Breaking it down into its constituent parts, I explain how this theory will provide a framework for the entire course and will inform their practices. There is also a good bit of instruction in fundamentals of logic, syllogisms, dialectic, and common material fallacies, to be precise, on the assumption that if they are intellectually engaged, when they speak, they'll have something of substance to say. In other words, thought is foundational to speech. Teaching rhetoric begins by placing it within the context of the liberal arts learning. Richard Weaver is the one that posits that rhetoric is the most humanistic of all disciplines. And it's because it either depends on all of these, or it's proper functioning, or it contributes to them in some fashion. So it's highly implicated in all of those humane studies. So it says it's the most humanistic of all disciplines. So you find that at the rhetoric ring. If you go to ring, pull down menu, in classical liberal arts, rhetoric in the classical liberal arts, it's down at the bottom right here. It's the last hot one, if you're interested. Classically educated young people should begin with a series of stair-stepped exercises to master foundational, then more advanced rhetorical dynamics. They learn by doing. They are informed by theory, but only enough theory to enlighten, not to overburden. Multum non multum. The line of demarcation between overburdening and sufficient rigor will, of course, vary among children. Make learning fun. Luther repeatedly characterizes learning as child's play and suggests that teachers overburden their students in part to build their own reputation. Luther actually, he was just nearly ruined by what he experienced under the scholastic educators of his day. And he purposed not to have that be the norm in Lutheran parochial schools. Okay, switching gears. So we could let me open it up for that. You could easily apply what I just read, that one little paragraph, to children in the grammar stage. Does anyone want to comment? Contribute? Tried to coax Miss Vincent into speak. At some point, we're going to do a joint presentation that covers the whole gamut from grammar through rhetoric. She's not ready. I don't know why.
You mean just?
I know a slacker, I guess. What?
I mean, I'm just making an enjoyable part of it.
No, they working with students to understand, to learn in a stair-step fashion and start to pay attention to rhetorical dynamics and musicality in language and that sort of thing. I have a very limited amount to say about that because I'm out of my bailiwick.
I think that they really enjoy that when they get into that, when to teach students rhetorical devices, and then they're reading good literature and they
Wordplay
find
is child's play.
Yes, they like to, it's like a Where's Waldo except for
Yeah.
rhetorical devices.
Yeah.
And they like to use it then too because they sound smart.
So if they enjoy that when they're in first and second grade, by third and fourth grade, we should be having them debate, right? They're not ready. And the point that Sayers makes, I think, is perfect. Once you cognitively develop to the point where you can abstract and see two sides of the same coin and see contraries, then you're ready to start on that. But even when you're ready to start disputations in the dialectical phase, doesn't mean you're necessarily ready to get up and argue. She makes the point, I just love it. I always jab my students with that. You know, she believed that they were supposed to just sit and listen and learn first because they're not really ready. They're too precocious. and lack discipline. Yes, ma'am? Were you going to?
I was going to add that third grade level kids really enjoy learning personification, similes and metaphors, and so
Yes.
building their ability to communicate in picture.
Yeah.
Which is really nice.
It's like magic when they first start to realize that that's going on in the story. Yeah. Okay. Then my argumentation and debate course closely examines the relationship between dialectic and rhetoric. It enables students to engage in practical argumentation by examining and discussing patterns of reasoning, fields of argument, and standards of evidence, and to apply classical rhetorical concepts to contemporary controversies. I teach this as rhetoric too at Wittenberg Academy. Because thought is fundamental to argument, the course begins with the fundamentals of logic. The logic instruction dispensed in public speaking at strategic intervals is condensed into a 3-week boot camp of the mind. So it repeats elements of the Rhetoric 1 course that are strategically placed throughout the term, and it condenses them into the review introduction boot camp. Boot Camp of the Mind concludes with a philosophical speech which draws upon the great books of the Western world. Okay, now this is what I was going to talk about when I ran out of time in my first session. And then a graduation ceremony. That great books of the Western world assignment is really interesting. It's really practical and philosophical simultaneously, and I would love to talk to you about it outside of class. Each of the 3 remaining units of the course, following Aristotle's Rhetorica, features a different context for arguing cases: court of law, moral dilemma, and policy controversy. I'm a casuist by trade, and what Aristotle does in his Rhetoric, he says, now, there are 3 venues in which one might need to be well supplied with lines of argument: in court of law, in the assembly, and in the contests, in ceremonial speaking. And so he has this division. What I did is, in my argumentation and debate class, trying to be Aristotelian, I have a unit on forensic argumentation that utilizes a lot of concepts from Cicero and Quintilian and so forth. And then there's a unit on deliberative rhetoric, which would be policy debate. That's the last unit. And instead of having ceremonial speaking, which is reserved for the advanced public speaking class where style and pathos is emphasized, that's held for that. In this class, we do an argument based on a moral dilemma involving a Jehovah's Witness and blood transfusion case. And they play ethics committee. Okay, that's kind of my bread and butter. My approach to advanced public speaking is also classical. The core of the course consists of imitatio, a pedagogical scheme originating in the classical world and widely practiced in medieval times, bless you, that exposes students to great oratory. After they study it, they imitate it. Once they develop a feel for stylistic excellence, they compose original works. This stair-step approach is very effective. The course is the right brain equivalent to argumentation and debate, building on the foundation in rhetoric from public speaking. It emphasizes style and the cultivation of imagination and memory over logic. Advanced public speaking begins with a refresher on rhetoric and the classical liberal arts, followed by focused study in elements of style. Real application of classical concepts begins with a memorized speech. An essentializing exercise follows, in which students first identify the essential message of that speech and then create an imitatio that applies that theme to a contemporary situation and emulates the style of the speech they memorize. The value of that is it helps them to see the enduring quality of the ideas that were dealt with in days of yore, and then apply how it applies to contemporary situations. Get a lot of mileage out of that. The course culminates in a student's choice speech that demonstrates mastery of course content. They learn a great deal about how to move an audience and more specifically, how to deploy figures of speech masterfully. Kind of touching on that earlier today. Taken together, these three courses constitute an integrated approach to the study and practice of rhetoric, which cultivates practical wisdom and eloquence. By understanding the concepts of rhetoric and practicing it as an art, students learn to reason with precision, spot faulty logic, exercise insight and forethought in deliberations, use language masterfully, and think both logically and analogically. In short, to instruct, persuade, and delight audiences. While this cycle of learning imparts both practical wisdom and eloquence, it also has ethical, moral, and theological dimensions. Rhetoric and dialectic, united as the regime of the human faculties intended, are involved in a complex and nuanced interplay, as Aristotle notes in the beginning of his treatise on rhetoric. Dialectic and rhetoric are antistrophes, counterparts of one another. They appear as two plants growing up side by side but share a common root below the surface. Phenomenologically, rhetoric is the art of argumentation. Dialectic, the art that tests the truth of debatable propositions. But that aspect of rhetoric that precedes argumentation, namely rhetorical reasoning, the faculty of discovering the crux of the matter in difficult cases, exposes their common root. Dialectical inference operates in rhetorical reasoning in a manner that accentuates just how deeply intertwined the two are. Think, for instance, about the manner in which an elder makes an argument to raise his pastor's salary by $2,000 for the coming fiscal year. The considerations that must be brought to bear, the counter-arguments that must be anticipated, the distinctions established prior to making a single argument, all bespeak the subtle interplay between dialectical inference, drawing fine distinctions, defining terms, and establishing parameters, and rhetorical reasoning, determining out of the potentially limitless parade of considerations which hold the most weight and are most relevant given the question at hand. Over time and in the natural course of things, learning to operate in this arena cultivates insight, discernment, prudence, foresight, mental discipline, and dexterity. It equips one to handle truth. We are not bodiless machines moved only by logic, but incarnated minds and souls moved by vivid images and inspired by beauty. One of the beautiful things about rhetoric is that it appeals to humans in their whole being. Crafting fine speeches and papers designed to move an audience to dream big dreams or think big thoughts requires aesthetic sensibility. Learning to use language artfully to appeal not only to the mind but also to the imagination and the heart is a humanizing activity for both speaker and audience. Albert Einstein's quip, "Imagination is more important than knowledge," bespeaks the importance of style and rhetoric. You can muster all the logic at your disposal, but if you fail to move your audience, you'll never persuade them. The end of persuasion is action. And to move an audience to action, you must move the soul. This view elevates the enterprise of speech composition. I reinforced this notion through a lecture on human excellence, asserting that excellence is, in keeping with Einstein's sentiment, more a matter of creativity than of logic alone. The cultivation of imagination and reason is best accomplished concurrently. In De Augmentis, Sir Francis Bacon defines rhetoric as, quote, "the application of reason to imagination for the better moving of the will." The application of reason to imagination for the better moving of the will. An apt introduction to the canon of style because it gets one thinking about the relation of style to pathos and movement of the soul as well, I might add. Style is about crafting strong mental imagery and building a verbal crescendo with the assistance of figures of speech. The canon of style deals with the appropriate use of poetry and aesthetics in argumentation, resulting in communication with a beauty and grace that adds impulse to the truth. Rhetoric in the final analysis, when I said this morning in my session that one of Plato's definitions for rhetoric is the enchantment of the soul, that hits on what I just read right there. Hits on the enchantment. That's what he meant by enchantment. It prompts the movement of the soul. Rhetoric in the final analysis moves the soul toward the good. So we teach our students to preside over their art with secure mastery, not a dry, sterile communication of ideas, but good reasoning combined with passion and vivid imagery to pique the imagination, to stir the emotions, to move the will. Vivacity is a key concept in classical rhetoric. Pastor, I would think you could play with this a lot in your presentation. Vivacity is the opposite of old, tired metaphors. The audience finds the vivid, lively idea striking. The opposite is moribund. Vivid imagery is thus key to rhetorical potency. A good metaphor laid before an audience imaginatively has the power to move. Indeed, the very appeal to the audience imagination pays compliment to their humanity. It cultivates their moral imagination and aesthetic sensibilities. This is why beauty matters and must be found in, with, and under rhetoric. But this power must be wielded with grace, decorum, propriety, proportion, and measure. Even in the fanciful dimensions of rhetoric, the speaker must cultivate good judgment. Rhetoric teaches one both to be good, to establish trust, and to aim at the good, to make the aim of persuasion true. The former entails the goodness cultivated within the rhetor, virtue, the latter, that to which and from which our rhetoric points. Trust is a precondition of persuasion. Similarly, a nagging feeling in the audience that one's aim is not true, that the proposed course of action may lead to ruination, naturally militates against rhetorical success. In Book 12 of his Institutes of Oratory, Quintilian argues that an orator must be a good man because he is to lead. Quintilian was interested primarily in raising up good leaders for the city-state. A leader cannot create civic virtue through good laws and the praise of virtue if he has not himself cultivated virtue or if his judgment is warped. Credible speech requires a credible speaker who must also love both the state and its citizens. Plato's prescription for redeeming rhetoric in his Phaedrus entails a methodology grounded in the study of the soul. Taking Plato's suggestion seriously, Aristotle makes ethos, personal character, one of the three modes of artistic proof. He asserts that a trustworthy character is required because, quote, we believe good men more fully and more readily than others. This is true generally, whatever the question is, and absolutely true where exact certainty is impossible and opinions are divided. In fact, character may also almost be called the most effective means of persuasion the rhetor possesses. Later in Book 2, Aristotle identifies phronesis, practical wisdom or prudence, with ethos. This is a key extension because phronesis is exercised with respect to the other. Plato's negative view of the sophists was motivated by his conviction that their distortions would warp the soul of Athenians. While we are far removed from 5th century BC Athens, our interest in the souls of our charges abides. Our students have souls, and this is the ultimate justification for teaching them old school, as it were. In the context of postmodernity, they need to be educated in this fashion simply to hold on to the faith we confess, a faith that confesses an absolute truth. Unless one believe this, one shall surely perish. This is unequivocal. Here's the end right here. In the Small Catechism, Luther, true to his classical training, employs rhetorical devices to facilitate learning and memorization. Take, for example, the section on the Creed. The ubiquitous "What does this mean?" begins each explanation, and the repetition of "this is most certainly true" is a hammer of God, driving the lesson deeper and deeper, fortifying the student's soul. Observe the deliberate use of couplets in the first article. He also gives me clothing and shoes, food and drink, house and home, wife and children, land, animals, and all I have. For all this, it is my duty to thank and praise, serve and obey you. This rhetorical scheme aids memorization. The rhythm established helps the lessons penetrate. The dialectical treatment of each chief part aids memorization. Why is this important? While cultivating our pupils' appreciation of these forms aids in memorization, it also develops habits of mind that make them more receptive to truth, better equipped for learning, and inclined to think in a principled, methodical, and sacramental fashion. In short, our children will feel at home within our faith tradition because liberal arts education gives them ears to hear better the rhythms of Scripture and eyes to see better the truths it expresses through images. Beyond the small catechism, Lutheran Melanchthon spearheaded a revival of classical liberal arts learning in Europe, the Lutheran gift to the civilized world. How tragic if our own children did not learn to think like Lutherans because we neglected that heritage. Are we done at 2 o'clock straight up or 2:15?
2.
2 o'clock. We do have a I'm going to yield the rest of my time, Mr. Speaker, to Pastor Cain to do a commercial for this next session.
I was fascinated by a book in particular that has only recently been translated. It's called The Pastor. It's a pastoral theology published by Concordia Publishing House by Wilhelm Leah. It publishes under one cover his 2 parts of his pastoral theology, and it gets very, very practical, like how a pastor should treat his servants. Insert joke here. Rhetoric, right? What I was fascinated about was the beginning essay of part 2. It wasn't written by Leah. It was written by Johann Eberlin. Anybody in the room ever heard of this guy? I hadn't. I've been a pastor 18 years. I went to seminary, been a Lutheran my whole life. He was a contemporary of Martin Luther. And Leah includes this essay about pastoral care, pastoral theology, and there was this one paragraph that I immediately photographed and sent to Dr. Tallmon. He said, if you're going to preach, you need to study rhetoric. You need to read the rhetoricians, Aristotle, Cicero, Quintilian, wait for it, Erasmus, and Melanchthon. Do you know how hard it is to find books on rhetoric by Erasmus and Melanchthon? You basically have to go to books.google.com, find somebody with an espresso book machine, which, by the way, they're awesome. They have them in Utah, Michigan, and at Harvard. And then for about $12, the good folks at Harvard Library printed off a copy of Melanchthon's 2 volumes of rhetoric for me and shipped it all the way to Wyoming. And they're in Latin. So you need to use the rest of your classical education to understand. As part of my commercial,
You did not send those to me.
No, I did not. And as part of my commercial, I would advertise this. If we are trying to recover our heritage, I think it's going to take a while. If it's taken this long to fall away, it will take a significant period of time to recover it, even one family, one parish, one student at a time. So please be patient with us, even those of us who have had many years on the board. We're still learning. And we're doing what good homeschool moms and dads do, right? We keep learning, and then we teach what we learn. And I feel like I'm only a couple of chapters ahead in what I'm about to present with you the next couple of days, but I'm already trying it in the pulpit. For example, I was trying to imitate the Reverend Matthew Harrison in his pulpit. He has his Greek New Testament sitting there, and a Post-it note, or most recently, if you've seen his Facebook feed, the back of his airline ticket had the outline for his sermon. He knows his outline. He knows his text. He knows his subject matter. He knows his hearers. And then he can go applying good rhetoric. So it's very scary the first few years of standing in front of your congregation with a manuscript and trying to keep good eye contact, right? Now imagine 15 years in doing the same thing without a manuscript, preaching the word. It's a good thing to put the fear of God back into.
I just wanted to say one quick thing, that we're involved in a restoration effort, and we're like people floating around on the seas, and every once in a while, a piece rises to the surface, and we pick it up and try to figure out where it fits, and it's going to take some time.
But unlike other recovery efforts, this body can be resurrected. So, on that Christian note, enjoy your breakfast.